As we come to these two chapters this evening, the title that I have given to this sermon is Fullness of Redemption. Fullness of Redemption. Now, 2 Sabbath evenings ago, whenever we began this two-part series on the book of Ruth, I suggested that a subtitle for the book of Ruth could be The Wisdom of Chesed. The Wisdom of Chesed. And I explained what Chesed is. It's the covenant faithfulness of God. It's that faithfulness of God that brings his promises, his covenant promises to pass and to fulfillment. And we can see in this book that the wisdom of God's chesed displayed in Ruth through the accomplishment of redemption by a strong one taking on weakness in self-sacrificial love. And when we looked at the first two chapters of Ruth, we considered the foretastes of redemption that Naomi experienced in the narrative of those two chapters. She was gone, but she was not forgotten. She was bitter, but she was not empty. She was suffering, but she was not forsaken. And we noticed the tremendous change that overcame Naomi towards the end of chapter 2. There she began to hope in the loving covenant faithfulness, in the chesed of God again. This evening, as we come to chapters 3 and 4, as we come to the second half of the story, we see that the activity that is contained in these two chapters, they all take place within 24 hours. But in these two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, we see the foretastes of redemption give way to the fullness of redemption. We see in this narrative how redemption comes to its completion by a strong one who takes the position of weakness in self-sacrificial love for Naomi. Now, the first point that I want us to see, we're going to look at this passage under three headings. The first heading is redemption planned, and that's all of chapter 3. Redemption planned. As the narrative opens in chapter 3, Naomi puts a plan to Ruth. She puts her plan to Ruth. Now, Naomi has been thinking about Boaz. He has come into her mind's eye, probably from the first day that Ruth mentioned his name, way back at the start of the barley harvest. You remember how Naomi had prayed for Ruth and for Orpah back in chapter 1, verse 9. She had prayed, "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of your husband." And Naomi has started to think, maybe Boaz is the answer to my prayer for Ruth. And so chapter 3 begins with a question from Naomi to Ruth. And she says, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" And then Naomi outlines her plan to Ruth. Naomi tells Ruth that she's to go and to get herself ready. She's to look her best. She's to go down to the threshing floor where Boaz will be, threshing the barley. And when he's finished eating and drinking, Ruth is to uncover his feet and lie down beside him. And then, well, Boaz, he'll know what to do. He'll take it from there. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, this is a very dangerous plan. If you want to know a bit about the moral climate of Israel in those days, just look at the last few chapters of Judges. It's harrowing reading. Ruth, if she goes along with Naomi's plan, if she ventures out at twilight, she's in serious danger. If Ruth had been at risk in any other field in broad daylight whilst gleaning during the harvest, then from the moment she left the house that evening at the edge of dark and headed for the threshing floor, she was in grave danger. But Ruth did as she was bid. She did what Naomi said. And she reaches the threshing floor safely. So far, so good. And then she watches Boaz. She watches him settle down for the night beside the heap of grain. And then she creeps in, she uncovers his feet, and she lies down. All well and good. But then at midnight, something startles Boaz. And he rolls over, and he feels around, and he feels the head of a woman, and she's lying at his feet. And in the darkness, he couldn't make out any distinguishing features. And so he says, "Who are you?" And to which the intruder replied, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And as Ruth utters that statement, she has just deviated from Naomi's plan. Boaz was the one who was supposed to give the instructions, but Ruth is the one who jumps in with her request. She has just proposed marriage to Boaz. Imagine the scene. It's midnight. Boaz was fast asleep, and suddenly he awakes with a jump to find a woman at his feet. And when he asks her to identify herself, she replies with a proposal of marriage. I'm sure it took Boaz a moment or two to gather himself, but he soon figures it all out. His reply, that's recorded in chapter 3, verse 10, it's very insightful. He says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter." He prays for God's blessing to be upon her. But what has Ruth done to prompt that response from him? He goes on, "You have made this latest or last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Now Boaz uses that word chesed there. He said, "You have made this latest kindness, or this latest act of chesed, greater than the first." What was the first kindness that Ruth showed? Well, chapter 2 and verse 11, Boaz says, but Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me." All that Ruth has done for her mother-in-law, that was the first kindness. What was it? She bound herself to Naomi by covenant. She bound herself to Israel by covenant. She bound herself to the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, by covenant. That was her first kindness. But what she has done now is an even greater display of covenant faithfulness. And we could sum it up like this. Ruth has proposed marriage to Boaz, not for love, not for money, but for Naomi. You see, she has asked Boaz to marry her because he was a redeemer. Now, this needs fleshed out a wee bit. And so, at this point, we should answer two questions. What was a redeemer? And what role did a redeemer play in the covenant community in ancient Israel? Well, in short, a redeemer was a close relative who would ensure the welfare of his extended family who happened to get into financial difficulties. And if you just want to, if you wanted to write down a reference to look at later, it's Leviticus 25:25. And that verse says, "If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold." It's important to remember that when Israel entered the promised land, each family inherited a certain portion of land, and this was to be theirs from generation to generation. It was never to leave that family. But if a family got into financial difficulty, they had an option. They could sell their land in order to raise the funds. Now, it would always come back to them. It would always come back to that family in the year of Jubilee. That was every 50 years. But there was a way to bring that parcel of land that they had sold, there was a way to bring that back into the family before the year of Jubilee. And that was if a redeemer could be found to buy it back for them. The actions of a redeemer would preserve the name of that family in that parcel of land. That was the aim of a redeemer, to make sure that the inheritance that this family had would remain theirs continually and constantly. But in this instance, in the story in Ruth, a redeemer who simply bought the land from Naomi, he would not be doing enough. Naomi had no children left. There was no one of Elimelech's family to inherit the land, to continue his name and his inheritance. In order for Boaz to fulfill the role of a redeemer, in its highest aim, he had to fulfill another role that's laid out in Deuteronomy chapter 25, and that's the role of the brother-in-law, as it's called. He had to redeem one of these widows by marriage. And within that marriage union, he was to raise up an heir for Elimelech. But as Naomi has told us in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, she's too old to have children. For this family, for Elimelech's family, for the inheritance that was in his family, there is only one hope. There is only hope in one woman, and that's in Ruth. If she doesn't take up this role as wife to a redeemer, then the name of Elimelech and his family will disappear from Israel. It will be as if Elimelech and his family never existed. But here is the really interesting thing. Ruth didn't need a redeemer. Ruth didn't need a redeemer. She could have married anyone. She could have married another man, taken his name, and lived happily ever after. As Boaz says in verse 10, she could have gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. She could have married for love or money or both if she'd really wanted to. She had no inheritance in Israel to safeguard. She wasn't going to lose out if she didn't marry a near relative of her dead husband. But Naomi did need a redeemer. On two accounts. She couldn't work to provide for herself in her land. She was impoverished. She wasn't fit enough to work. She couldn't hire labourers to work the land. She needed a redeemer, not only to buy the land for her, but also to work it. And she also needed someone to rescue her dead husband's name and safeguard his inheritance. So what is Ruth doing through her proposal to Boaz? And this is Ruth's plan. She knows that the only way for Naomi to be provided for in every way is for her, Ruth, to marry a relative of Elimelech and raise up an heir to Elimelech's name and inheritance. And so what does she do? She voluntarily and self-sacrificially lays aside her own liberty for the sake of Naomi. And Boaz recognizes that Ruth knows what she's about. She is knowingly laying aside her own liberty for Naomi. How would we describe what Ruth is doing here? It's covenant faithfulness. It's just what Boaz says. It's chesed. This is the last or the latest kindness that Boaz refers to. But it flows from the first. Ruth has bound herself to Naomi by covenant, and this is the outworking of that covenant faithfulness. In Naomi's plan, she wanted rest for Ruth. But in Ruth's plan, she wanted redemption for Naomi. Naomi was honourable, yes, but Ruth was self-sacrificial. But there's a wrinkle in the plan. Boaz it was indeed a redeemer, but there's a nearer redeemer. There is one who had a prior right to redeem and marry Ruth. But Boaz is quick to assure Ruth that if this other redeemer, if he won't step up, then Boaz, will most assuredly step up. As dawn approaches, after this conversation between Ruth and Boaz, as dawn approaches, Boaz is concerned that Ruth's character suffers no unnecessary slander. So he sends her away before daybreak. But before she goes, he gives her a sign and a seal of his covenant faithfulness towards her. He gives her as much grain as she can muster the strength to carry. But it's also a sign to Naomi. As Ruth later explains to Naomi all of the previous night's proceedings, she repeats what Boaz said. He said, "You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." Or as it is literally, you must not go back empty to your mother-in-law. This is a signal to Naomi that Boaz will cheerfully do the duty of a redeemer. It's a foretaste of the great filling that Naomi will experience. And so, as the wait commences, Naomi reassures Ruth that Boaz will not rest until the matter is settled that day. That brings us, secondly, to redemption accomplished. Redemption accomplished, the first 17 verses of chapter 4. As we enter chapter 4, the narrative accelerates towards its conclusion. But we still have this hurdle of the other redeemer to cross. How will Boaz handle this? Boaz is an honest man, but he's good with diplomacy. Chapter 4 begins with Boaz sitting down at the gate. That's where all of the judicial and the civil matters of the city were dealt with. And the other redeemer comes along, and at the invitation of Boaz, he sits down along with 10 elders of the city. And Boaz begins by inviting the unnamed redeemer to buy from Naomi the land that belonged to Elimelech. The other man, he says, "I'll buy it." He doesn't have to think twice. And Boaz says one more thing. Verse 5. Chapter 4, verse 5. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. There's a condition to the sale. Ruth's hand in marriage. And the other redeemer thinks for a minute and he says, "I can't do that. I can't redeem it." Somehow or other, marrying Ruth and raising up an inheritor, an heir to Elimelech's inheritance, it would jeopardize his own inheritance. With this right of redemption came a responsibility, as we saw. The one who assumed the right to redeem the land must assume the responsibility to marry Ruth and raise an heir to Elimelech and Naomi's inheritance. This other redeemer, he initially jumped at the offer to buy Naomi's land. He saw a deal that could not be missed. He had first refusal to buy land with no strings attached. You see, he saw Naomi with no children. If he bought the land for Naomi, then he was in line to get the land. It was going to be his. But then as Boaz reminded him of his obligation to marry Ruth and to continue the line of Elimelech, he saw he couldn't take on that responsibility. And so then he tells Boaz, "You take my right of redemption to yourself." And Boaz doesn't have to be told twice. He declares to the elders and the assembled crowd that he will indeed take on both the right of redemption of the land and the responsibility to marry Ruth, to raise an heir to Elimelech. I'm sure Ruth and Naomi were both in the crowd at the gate that morning, and you can just feel the joy wash over them as the whole matter was resolved and as the way was opened for Ruth and Boaz to be married. The crowd that was gathered there, they greet this news with a prayer in verse 11. They said, "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." They pray for an abundance of children for Boaz and Ruth. They also pray that Boaz may act worthily. Again, this is the same word that was used to describe him in chapter 2, and it was the word that he used to describe Ruth that night at the threshing floor. The people acknowledge that Boaz acts in covenant faithfulness, and their prayer is that by God's grace he may continue to do so. Now, I mentioned earlier that the fate of the line of Elimelech hinged on Ruth. Well, ultimately, it hinged on God. Would God provide an heir to carry on the line of Elimelech? Well, in verse 13, we find our answer. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. God is the one who is in absolute control. He was the one who created that new life in Ruth's womb. That might seem like a natural place to end the narrative. But the writer knows there's more that we need to see. There's something in what the women say at the birth of this covenant child that we can be quick to pass over. Before we see what they say, we need to ask the question, who was Naomi's Redeemer? Who was Naomi's Redeemer? The obvious answer might seem to be Boaz. Surely it was him. He redeemed Ruth. He redeemed the land. But the answer is maybe not just as obvious. There's something we need to notice from verse 14 and verse 15. Let's read it together from chapter 4. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." The women point out to Naomi that the Redeemer that the Lord has provided for her, it's not Boaz, it's baby Obed. He is the Redeemer. He is the one who will restore life to Naomi. He is the one who will be the nourisher of her old age. Yes, Boaz is a Redeemer in the story. And indeed, it is through the hesed shown by Boaz and Ruth that this redemption comes to Naomi. But ultimately, Naomi's Redeemer is Obed. Here's something amazing. In the birth of a baby, whose name means servant, redemption in its fullness was provided for Naomi. Yes, this one would grow up to be a strong man, but what would his strength be spent for? In being the restorer of life and a nourisher of Naomi in her old age. Redemption in its fullness would come to Naomi when this strong one, when Obed, would self-sacrificially take on the role of servant for Naomi. Well, that's the narrative. But what is the big picture? What's the big picture? We see this in verses 18 to 22 of chapter 4. What are we meant to see? There's something really interesting about verses 18 to 22. That section, it begins in verse 18 with these words, "Now these are the generations of... ... To the original audience, that was a trigger phrase. A trigger phrase. It made them think of something else. It made them think of somewhere else in the Bible. It made them think of Genesis. That phrase occurs, "Now these are the generations of." It occurs about 10 or 11 times in Genesis. And quite often in Genesis, it marks a new chapter in God's dealings with his people. The sections introduced by those words, "Now these are the generations of," they would quite often include a striking deliverance. But they would conclude with the introduction of a new deliverer. And this is what we have here. In this story, we have the deliverance of Naomi, ultimately through Obed. But the story concludes with the introduction of David, the greater deliverer of Israel. The first audience, the returnees from exile, they were meant to see that the deliverance that they had experienced from exile would lead to the introduction of a new deliverer. This new deliverer would be greater than the previous ones. Just as the deliverance of Naomi through Obed resulted in the birth of David, so the deliverance of the exiles would result in the birth of the son of David. What are we meant to see? We are meant to see that what God did for covenant-breaking Israel in the times of the judges through David, the great-grandson of Ruth, he has done to an infinitely greater scale through the greatest son of David, Jesus, the Messiah. Not only was a family in danger of being wiped out, not only was Israel on the brink of oblivion, the entire world was under the curse of fallen Adam. But Jesus Christ has accomplished redemption. He is to his people the restorer of life. He is the one who took upon himself the form of a servant, became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, in order to redeem his people from their sins. The woman of Bethlehem said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer." 12 centuries later, at the birth of Obed's greatest redeemer son, in that very same town of Bethlehem, those words echoed to all Israel and to the uttermost parts of the earth, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer." This book is ultimately pointing to the great Redeemer, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. But not only is it pointing to him, it's pointing us to one particular aspect of the redemption that he accomplishes for his people. The redemption that Naomi received and experienced was very specific. Naomi was suffering. She was experiencing anguish of soul. She grieved for her husband and her 2 sons. She experienced the suffering of abject poverty. She knew destitution in the extreme. And we cannot assign any blame to Naomi for any of this, because Elimelech was the one who had the final say in the decision to leave Bethlehem. As far as Scripture tells us, Naomi suffered all of this through no fault of her own. But it was this suffering from which she was redeemed. Now fast forward to today. I want you to imagine someone, and this person exists. I want you to imagine a woman in her 20s or 30s who suffers every day with severe and painful physical deformities and mental trauma, and all of which has come upon her as the result of a botched abortion attempt by her mother. This woman lives every moment of every day with the life-debilitating effects of her mother's sin. She suffers through no fault of her own. She suffers from the sins of others. She did nothing to deserve the suffering that she endures. Now, I want to ask you a question, and it's a tough question, but we need to face it. We need to ask it. What does the gospel offer that woman? What does the gospel offer that woman who suffers from the sins of others? If we were to ask 100 evangelical churchgoers, what does the gospel offer? ? How many would simply say forgiveness of sins? Probably 90% at least. We could safely assume 90% would say the gospel offers forgiveness of sins. And they would not be wrong. They wouldn't be wrong. But they wouldn't be entirely right. Of course, the gospel offers forgiveness of sins. We're told that in black and white in the Scriptures. But that's not the whole story. And it's not the whole story because the need for forgiveness is not the whole problem. We're not simply individual sinners. We are a fallen race. And so not only do we commit sins, but we cause the suffering of others by our sins, and we suffer ourselves because of the sins of others. Because of Adam's sin, we are part of the fallen race of humanity. And as the Shorter Catechism says, the fall brought mankind into an estate of sin and misery. And so the gospel must address those three things. The gospel must address our fallen condition in Adam, and flowing from that, personal guilt and suffering. If the gospel is to address our total need, it must bring us to God, dealing with our guilt and our suffering. But what did Jesus do for his people? The Shorter Catechism again asks the question, wherein did Christ's humiliation consist? What was it that made up Christ's humiliation? Part of the answer says that he endured the miseries of this life, the wrath of God, and the cursed death of the cross. He endured suffering, wrath, and curse to deal with our suffering, guilt, and fallen condition. Each one of us, as fallen in Adam, is what we could describe a guilty sufferer. But Jesus redeems his people by taking the place of guilty sufferers who are fallen in Adam. In the book of Revelation, we're told two things. We're told that Jesus washes away his people's sin, and he wipes away their tears. Sin and suffering are banished from the new heavens and the new earth. Why? Because God dwells with his people. And you see, that's the great covenant fulfillment. That is the great end of redemption. The promise came to Abraham, I will be God to you and to your seed after you. I will be their God and they will be my people. And when God comes in the new heavens and the new earth to dwell with his people, the fall is reversed. And more than reversed. In Christ, the one who has redeemed us, the covenant people of God receive more than Adam lost. They have fellowship with God in the height, the depth, and the breadth of divine love. And so sin and suffering are forever driven away. And what has secured this? Hesed. The covenant faithfulness of God to carry through the word of his covenant promise through a strong one, taking on the form of a servant, self-sacrificially laying down his life for his people. That's the gospel's answer to suffering. That's the gospel's answer to Naomi's suffering, and it's God's answer to your suffering. Christ the Redeemer redeems from sin and from suffering by dealing with the cause of both. He will bring us into the immediate presence of God to dwell with him. Sin and suffering being no more than, even if that, a distant memory. As you look at the suffering in the life that you're now living, listen to what Paul says. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Amen. Let's stand together for prayer.